Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. I'm your host, Manu Meal. This is episode 62. It's a DNC special because guess what? The DNC starts today. And you know what else starts today? Actually, it'll start at the end of Thursday, which is the political game that will play out now for the next 100, I think, days it is, till November 4th. But the game is starting. And we're all not even players in the game. We're all pieces in the game. And you're like, Manu, what are you talking about? I want to hear about abortion. I want to hear about democracy. I want to hear about immigration. I want to hear about what your analysis of the candidates. Well, you can go to a lot of other shows for that. The Hopeful Majority is about exposing the game that is our politics, that is driving our polarization, because I think that the thesis of the show has always been that most people like you and I are not actually contributing to the polarization of the country. It is the elites, it is the vocal extremes across our political spectrum that traffic in outrage instead of nuance. And oh boy, we're in for it. So let's get ready. Let's strap in. Today, we're going to expose the game. It's another solo episode, and then we're going to go back to our regular interviews. I'm going to catch you in the monologue in 3, 2, 1. Let's cue the intro. The DNC is here. This is the second convention in international politics. The first one was the RNC, which happened 2 weeks ago, as you all know. Actually, 3 weeks ago, I think. And now it's time for the Democrats to respond. I think there's a lot of important news. A lot of things are going to happen over the next couple of days. You're going to hear a lot from the Democrats. And obviously, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are going to be the Democratic contenders for president, vice president, respectfully. But what I think is more interesting about this moment is I think it's incumbent upon us to start exposing how the game of politics is played, to start giving you the insight, the tools to look at the way in which the loudest voices in our politics polarize and divide us, how they play on our instincts to turn against each other. Because let's face it, the Democrats are going to have their points, the Republicans are going to have their points, President Trump, Vice President Harris, they're going to go after it with each other. But ultimately, I think what's going to happen is you're going to end up on November 4th. People are going to cast their votes. And the fact is, no matter what happens on November 4th, half of the country is going to be incredibly sad, and the other half of the country is going to be elated. But I think through all of that, there's a couple of things to pay attention to because it's time to expose the game. There's 3 things you got to look out for. Because I think that if we can start paying attention to how our polarization and our outrage plays into the moment, I think we can start slowly stitching back together a civic fabric where we actually see the common humanity in each other and try to actually solve our problems. If we, the people, can start unplugging from the game, if we can actually say no to the outrage and say yes to the nuance, then I think we can actually get somewhere. And the goal of the show, through its conversations, through its interviews, through you and I sitting together, is to recognize, I think it's time to start unplugging from the game. And I think it's time to start paying attention to the nuances and the complexity of the moment to actually solve our problems. It's time to be real citizens, real agents. Let's take our power back. 3 things to look out for. The first is the time is going to be now, where once the DNC ends, both candidates are going to be turning you against each other. They're going to be turning us against each other. Now, here's the most important thing. Of course, you're sitting here and saying, Manu, I've got deep dissatisfactions and fear of another President Trump election. Or, Manu, I do not want Kamala Harris anywhere near the White House. There are real divides. There are real conflicts. Of course, we're divided. Of course, that candidate does not represent my views, or this candidate doesn't represent my views. So I'm going to show up in the public square ready to fight. I get that impulse. Here's my point. You want to know what my point is? My point is, of course, you're going to direct your anger and ire towards one of the presidential candidates or the vice presidential candidates. Of course, the media is going to point out how different they are. But the question is whether or not we actually give in to hating each other as Americans who are voting for those different candidates. That's what I'm talking about. Don't turn against each other. Because what the campaigns want, what the political leaders want, is that if you hate that Kamala Harris voter, if you are fearful of that President Trump voter, if you feel like there's no chance at common ground with that person, suddenly you're going to show up to that ballot box because your neighbor is literally evil. You get what I'm saying? They're going to try to turn us against each other because that is what leads to turnout. That is what leads to a high intensity election. And that is what leads to essentially one of the candidates winning. It's a yes-no binary, good versus evil. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't radically disagree with the candidates. Of course, we got to disagree with the candidates. That's politics. We got to have real visceral arguments and tension. But the question is whether or not our hatred, I would say, for a certain candidate turns into hatred for us as fellow Americans. And why is it important? to not hate our fellow Americans? Now, I'm even surprised I got to answer this question, but it feels like it's necessary because I can see the level of cynicism rising on social media and our platforms where people are saying, I've had enough of that side. There's no reason to even sit down and engage with that side. I'll ask you this. What's the alternative? What happens if we don't have that conversation with the person that we fundamentally disagree with? Where do you think the endpoint leads? And here's the fact of conflict and polarization. The losers are not our leaders. They're us. Because in a battle space where it's us versus them, the only fact of life is that you just got to resist. And if you're always resisting, that's easy as a political leader. You don't got to govern. All you got to do is fight the other side. You got to rile up your base. And if you rile up the base, what happens? The base gets angrier and angrier, and we as Americans continue to divide. And guess who gets rich during that process? Guess who doesn't have to actually solve problems? Guess who gets to just sit there and say, the other side sucks, and by the way, I can't get anything done. But this election, vote for me. We know that game. It's time to watch out for that tactic. Yes, go vote. Yes, go stand up for your candidate. But remember, your vote for a candidate does not have to translate to hate for your fellow American. That's the point. Point number 2 to look out for. I just read this headline in CNN, and let me pull it up real quick. It said, inside the Gen Z social media operation of the Kamala Harris campaign. That was sort of the title. Essentially what it's getting at is that the Kamala Harris campaign, and by the way, it references President Trump's campaign as well, are led by, young people like me, my age folks that are driving the social media game, right? Why is it that the two campaigns are so heavily investing in their social media operations? Of course, you got to win the social media game. Of course, that's where influence happens. That's where the traction happens. But, in past campaigns, a lot of people invested a lot in policy teams. A lot of people invested in the ground game. People invested in grassroots canvassing. People invested in people going out there and doing calls to individual voters. Why is it that right now the leading investment of both campaigns is in their social media operations, and specifically the memification of politics, which is what we've talked about in previous episodes? Go watch me talking about how we exposed the Biden-Trump debate and this tactics in that, right? We're living through the memification of politics. So why is it that these campaigns are so focused on their social media operation and have little investment in terms of other areas? It's because, as you've heard this phrase many times, we live in the outrage industrial complex. We live in the nationalization of our politics. Because all of us are spending all of our time on our phones and on Twitter and X and Instagram and TikTok, the local issue is important, but what's really given us the dopamine rush is watching that weird clip of President Trump doing something dumb, or Vice President Kamala Harris saying something that was just obscure, or that laugh that a lot of people play, right? And so what happens is that social media and our ability to just be outraged at each other is what ultimately wins the election. And if that sounds great to you, then don't listen to this point. But I think most people listen to this show, and most people in our country are going to say, elections should not be won by whether or not who wins the social media game, because ultimately the president of the United States is not running to be the funniest person in the history of humanity on TikTok. What they're running to do is to manage the nuclear arsenal of the United States. They're working to try to solve foreign policy. They're working to meet your domestic needs, right? So our election and what we're picking for is not translating to what the job is. You winning on social media has very little to do with whether or not you can govern. Now, it's always been the case in our campaigns that winning politics is different than trying to govern. But now the chasm between those two is so incredibly wide. So what that means is that both campaigns are going to be focused on memes. They're going to be focused on making sure that you see some snippet of some video from some obscure event, and that's going to cover the headlines. Great example of this was Tim Walz, vice presidential candidate Tim Walz on the Democratic side. He was at an event, a campaign event, I think a long time ago, and there's a small clip of him talking about how he carried a weapon into war. Yes, that's an important thing to uncover, but the fact is that that small video is what has now dominated the news cycle about Walz's military service. So what we got to watch out for and remember is that these campaigns are investing in their social media because they know that you are susceptible. And when we're susceptible, then what happens is that they continue to play on that outrage. You're probably not going to hear this podcast, but what you're going to see is Kamala Harris's clip. Now you say, look, it's because Kamala Harris's clip is funnier. Fine. I get that. I'm not a comic, but what I am is someone that cares about the future of this country. And so if me caring about the future of the country means me putting out content that I think is relatively nuanced, That's not going to sell. If you want an end to the memification of politics, understand the game that the political leaders are playing, the campaigns are playing, and unplug from it. Take a second to read a longer article about the nuanced policy positions of both candidates. Take a moment to educate ourselves on, well, what does Kamala Harris actually believe on, let's say, criminal justice? Or what does President Trump's policy proposal involve around the border, right? What is he actually saying? But that's probably not going to happen because we're going to get all of our information, our dosage from TikTok, right? And that short content, well, man, that short content is about to drive the race. And I think it's time to watch out for that. And last point, last thing to watch out for. The Democrats are going to make this entire election about abortion and democracy. And the Republicans are going to make this entire election about immigration and how Kamala Harris owns President Biden's record. That's going to be the election. Now, of course, when you're running a campaign, you got to have the wedge issues. My point is, while those issues are incredibly important, especially if you're a person that's deeply affected by one of those issues, it matters. I'm not undermining the importance of those issues. What I'm saying is our country is a lot more than just abortion and the border. Those are very important issues, but there's like 97 other issues that also matter. Why do I point this out? Because when the entire election is going to focus on abortion and the border, and abortion is going to be the Democrats' call and cry to rally the base, and the Republicans are going to talk about immigration and the invasion of the border. And by the way, you can check out both of our episodes on the immigration question and the abortion question, explain the nuanced perspectives of both rather than sort of the outrage perspectives that people have, right? The point is, then what's going to happen is that those two issues are going to define and paint the way that people are divided. So, of course, every society is going to have pivotal wedge issues where it's a 50-50 split or a 60-40 split, a very deep split, a passionate split, right? But because you look at the entire country through the lens of abortion and the border, and President Trump's threat to democracy and Kamala Harris' threat to the very fabric of American society, if you're from the Republican standpoint, then of course you're going to think the country's going to hell. Of course you're going to think that your fellow American's crazy. Because it's like, imagine you came to my house and the only way you judged my house was based on whether or not the basement was finished. Basement looks ugly. Does that mean my entire house and my family's screwed? Probably not. But if that's the only perception you get, then you're being played. I'm sorry, you're being played. When the media covers abortion 24/7, when the media covers the border 24/7, when the media covers President Trump's threat to democracy, again, all these issues are very important. What I'm hedging against is, rather than falling into the media's trap and the political leaders' trap because they want you to fall into it because it makes their lives easier, rather than doing that, let's take a step back and not let those issues paint our perception of our fellow Americans. Now you say, so what, Manu? What's the point of all of this? Talk about these 3 points. You talked about don't let your vote for a candidate turn you against your fellow American. You talked about the social media operations of both these campaigns and why that's the case. You talk about the entire divide in the country being painted through the lens of 2 or 3 policy issues. Why does any of this matter? So what if I hate my fellow American? Just listen to that question for a second. So what if I hate my fellow American? The fact that we are at that point, President Lincoln said that a house divided is what is the biggest threat to the threat of that house and the future of that house. Internal domestic threats. We are sowing the destruction of our own country because every issue, every wedge has to be exploited. And the people that lose in this environment are not our leaders, but it's us. If we do not figure out how to mend the fabric between our fellow citizens, everything is lost. Democracy rests on the notion that we can talk to each other for the sake of having real disagreements to get to the best ideas to solve our very critical problems. And our society currently is not fit for that. It's not incentivizing that. I point out these 3 things to be aware of as this DNC ends on Thursday and we go into the rest of the year and November 4th approaches, to just take a moment to realize that it's time to stop being played. Because the more we get played, the more they profit. And I mean that literally. Let's unplug. I'm so excited for you to join this conversation, this show. Because every week we do stuff like this. It's nuanced dialogues with different interview candidates and interesting figures. We've got a fascinating interview coming up next week, and sometimes it's monologues like this. Ultimately, the goal is that the hopeful majority of Americans like us are ready to take back the way that our politics is engaged and discussed, because ultimately what requires us to actually solve our problems is for us to understand that it's time to unplug from the game because that's easy for them. I appreciate you. I'll see you next week. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. And by the way, if you're on YouTube, you see I'm no longer wearing the hoodie because I got a lot of hate for the hoodie. People are like, man, you can't show up to the podcast with a hoodie. Now, in my defense, it was a Bridge USA hoodie. And if you don't know what Bridge USA is, Google it, because it's the way that we actually start stitching together the civic fabric in high schools and colleges. And if you're in Spotify and Apple, I appreciate you. Rate the episode through those star things. Leave a comment. Subscribe and follow, because we're going to build this hopeful majority together, and I'll see you next week.